finance committee.
Okay.
Assuming I get to know him
Yeah,
up there.
yeah.
We keep,
And then we know him in Wheaton, and then he taught for us off and on a little
Right,
bit. So,
right.
All right, everyone. We're going to go ahead and get started with our event. First, a couple announcements. I would like to thank everyone who's been out here for the Praxis events throughout the semester. We put on some good ones, and hopefully we're going to end off on a bang here. Additionally, check out your emails. There's going to be should be an email at some point in the near future about econ party at the end of the year. So keep an eye out for that. So any waste of time, I'd like to go ahead and introduce Dr. P.J. Hill, who is a professor emeritus at Hillsdale College in Illinois, where he taught economics for over 25 years. He's also a senior fellow at PERC, which is the Property and Environmental Research Center in Bozeman, Montana. Dr. Hill's academic career has resulted in a number of highly regarded works in the fields of property rights theory and institutional change in entrepreneurship. He has written and co-authored 7 books, including The Political Economy of the American West, The Technology of Property Rights, The Not So Wild Wild West, and co-authoring Growth and Welfare in the American Past with Nobel laureate Douglas North. Also, while also having an academic career, he also has a significant amount of ranching experience. He has been involved in cattle ranching throughout his academic career. His favorite economist is F.A. Hayek, and also in the ballpark there is Thomas Sowell. So now, without any further delay, here's Dr. P.J. Hill on the Not So Wild Wild West.
Okay, thank you. We got a little glitch here in that the clicker won't work, so Daniel's my clicker, so I will signal to him at various points whenever we need to change. So, first slide. I'm an economist and a retired professor, and one of the things that was delightful about being a professor was giving quizzes. So guess what? You get a quiz. I hope you've got a piece of paper or a pencil you can borrow from your neighbor. I want you to write down a number. Go ahead, here's the question. I want you to give me your best estimate of the number of bank robberies in the western states, and I list the states there. There's a couple that are gone just because we don't have good data on them, but we got a pretty good sized period, about a 41-year period there. Give me a number. Write down a number. I want you to actually have it recorded, and so, and I'm not sure if I'm going to let Charles and Gary guess or not. They may not get the prize. The prize, they can actually buy their own books. The prize is a copy of the Not So Wild Wild West. You can ask them if they already have a copy. That'll be interesting. But you have to come up with a number. You can write it on your phone. You can do whatever sorts of things with it. But I want you to come up with a number of your best estimate of how many total bank robberies during that period of time in those states. Okay? And the prize is a copy of the book, and if you're really close, I might even autograph it for you. Have you thought a number? You're not going to turn them in. I'm just going to ask you to come up with them, and we'll try to come up with a winner here. You say you got your number, okay? How many of you are from 1,000 to 5,000? How many of you are in that range? I got 3 or 4. Okay. What about from 500 to 999? Okay. Several of you in that range. What about 100 to 499? Oh, quite a few of you there. What about from 50 to 100? Less than 50. Oh, okay. Gary, you can't guess. What's your number?
45.
45.
40.
40.
5.
5. 50?
15.
15.
20.
20. What?
23.
23. So
23.
22. So yours is 5. Yours is 15. Okay. Let's look at the number here. Another one. Between 8 and 12. Now I'm not sure quite what to do with that. You're off by 3.
I've got 10.
I didn't ask you. And that really was your number?
Yeah.
Oh, honest man. Okay. you get the prize. So come up afterwards and you'll get an autographed copy. This comes from Larry Schweikert, economic historian, called a non-existent frontier bank robbery. And the reason I put this up is because what do you think of when you think of the West? One of the things we think of is it's a pretty, a pretty raucous sort of a place where this is a Charles Russell painting. Russell was one of the famous artists in Montana. And this isn't a bank robbery. This is actually a shoot up at a saloon. That might have happened. But when we think of the West, oftentimes we think of something going on as something like the bank robbery, sort of a case where a bunch of tough hombres ride into town. They throw their bridle reins over the hitching post. They stomp into the bank and they say, "Give me your money." Now, by the way, this is not driven by the fact that there weren't many banks. There were banks. Finance was a pretty important thing to have on the frontier, so many towns had small banks. But think about what was going on there in that sort of a situation. So these guys stomp into the bank. They tell you, put the money in the saddlebags. The terrified teller puts the money in the saddlebags. They throw them over the horse, maybe the cantle of the horse, and race out of town. The hapless sheriff, maybe in a couple of hours, gets a posse together and they try to chase them down. They probably don't succeed, and so the bank robbery goes on. Yes?
I noticed you didn't include Minnesota.
Didn't include what?
Minnesota.
Yeah, I didn't include Minnesota. And that might have been more, or do you have some records there that might say that there were more in Minnesota?
I mean, that was also where the Dalton game.
Okay, right. Basically, we were trying to look at, we don't generally consider Minnesota part of the West, but at that point it might have been. Texas isn't in there, Montana's in there, not in there, mostly just because of data problems there. But think about the situation with a bank. So the guys ride into town, they go into the bank, what do you think people are saying? Hey, 4 guys came into the bank. We don't hardly ever see 4 guys come into the bank. The rumor goes through the little town. Maybe it's got 500 people, maybe it's got 800, maybe 1,200. Hey, there's a bank robbery, there's a bank robbery. They get out, they jump on their horses, and they ride out of town. What happens to them?
They get shot.
Every household has a shotgun, a rifle. Some of them have handguns. That's not very important, but you need something, and you've got a steer that's crippled, and you've got a horse you got to put down, and you've got coyotes that are coming on, you've got wolves. So you have handguns, you have long rifles, you have all sorts of guns. How often do you think people could get out of town on their horses in that sort of a situation? Not very often. My dear mother shot a turkey for Thanksgiving. Wild turkeys were in our backyard, and she shot it. And I said, "Oh, how'd you shoot it?" She says, "Well, I shot it through the head. I didn't want to waste any meat." So what do you think? She was a frontier woman. What do you think these people could do to the people riding out of town? They took them out. Now, there were more stagecoach robberies. So it's not the case because stagecoaches were not defended as well. But part of this is just a way to say that when we think about the West, is it a place of anarchy, a place of chaos? How did people come together to try to solve problems of collective action or social coordination? And this is in the absence of what we think of as formal institutions. Conditions were very different. Agriculture was different. Rainfall was different. Part of it was part of the mountainous West. So the question is, was it harmony or was it conflict? And I'm going to argue that it was basically harmony because of ground-up evolution of institutions that solved collective action problems and allowed people to live relatively peaceful, relatively productive sorts of lives. Let's go to the Native Americans. What about the case there? This is a fish trap in the Pacific Northwest. And in the Pacific Northwest, salmon come upstream to spawn. And did the Native Americans just use everybody come, it's all equal sort of a situation? No. That's kind of a myth sometimes, but it was very much an incentive-based property rights world. Now, the property rights were different, particularly among the migratory tribes and what we would think of among, say, place-based agriculture in much of the West. But these fish traps worked fairly well for giving people property. And they were not individual, they were tribal. There was a little bit of a larger group that contained that sort of a right. But that right was real, it was defined, it was enforced. In fact, they even had fish trap markers there. We think of them as kind of the advent of the totem pole, but many of those were just markers along the particularly fish traps. Let's go back to the fish traps for a moment. Make sure where I'm at here. One of the puzzles for a period of time for fish biologists in the Northwest was the difference in the size of salmon in different streams. Because some streams had much larger salmon. Salmon spawn upstream, they go out, live in the ocean for a period of time, they come back upstream to spawn. But one of the real puzzles was, why were salmon in some streams much larger than salmon in other streams? And the fish biologists look at feedstock, weather conditions, those sorts of things. It wasn't until the anthropologists got to looking at tribal boundaries that it made sense. Some of the fish traps were well within a long-term tribal area. Now, the Native Americans learned pretty quickly about fish genetics. And which fish do you want to kill? Well, maybe you don't want to kill, there is some size difference in salmon. Maybe you don't want to kill all the large salmon. Large salmon's babies turn out to be large salmon. So you left some of the salmon to go upstream to spawn to increase the genetic stock of the salmon. However, there were a few places that were right on the borderline between particular tribes. And in those places, you didn't have long-term control. You might run the fish trap for a couple of years, but then the other tribe would take it over and they would get it for a period of time. So it depended upon the relative power of those particular, of your control of the fish trap. So if you only think you've got it for a year or two, what do you take? You take everything. You don't worry about size. And so it turns out the difference in the size of the salmon in the Pacific Northwest streams very much depends on the permanency of property rights. In the place where they had relatively stable permanent property rights, it worked pretty well. They were able to try to secure long-term benefits out of that. Let's go to bison, commonly called buffalo. Another case. What about the incentives for hunting on the frontier? Now, by the way, if you know anything about the history of the West, this is, of course, post-horse. The horse changed dramatically the hunting of bison. Prior to the horse, the pedestrian hunt was a very, very difficult sort of a thing to do. And if the snow conditions were just right, you could wear snowshoes and stay on the top of the snow. If the conditions was right and the bison couldn't get through the snow, and you might be able to take one down. And there were the buffalo jumps, where again, was not an easy sort of a thing to do, to think about driving a whole herd of bison over a cliff. There's one of them about 10 miles from my ranch. And there you can go back, the anthropologists that have worked there said it was in use for several thousand years. But here we get the horse, and things change a lot. So the question is, share and share alike? Well, I've ridden some fairly good horses over some fairly rough country fairly rapidly, and I would be terrified to be in that sort of a situation. Look at that guy. They were going at a full gallop. He's trying to get up alongside of that horse, and he's trying to put his lance into it. In that sort of a situation, would you perhaps want an incentive-compatible sort of an arrangement? Or do you just share and share alike? Turns out, if you look at that lance, it has some wrapping around it. That identifies that particular hunter. Every arrow is marked. You can see the guy in the background that's using a bow and arrow. The person, when they got all done, they would go back and try to figure out which was the one that killed it. The one that killed it got a double portion, because this is a pretty risky activity. Can you imagine getting on your horse and going out there with your buddies, and you're going to go bison hunting, and there goes the herd, and boy, you know, they all take after it and you don't quite make it. And when you get all done, you say, boy, I'm sure glad this is a share and share alike economy, because the bison went left and I went right, and I was just wrong, and I'm just sorry, but I'm sure glad I'm getting my share. That's not the way it worked. They wanted to make it incentive compatible. They wanted to make it so there was a good reason to try to be the person. Now, there was some, you know, probably some machismo in terms of being there, and being a bison hunter was gave you just some credence overall. Interestingly enough, because the horse were so important, and a good bison horse might not be owned by a good bison hunter, a rental market developed in horses, so that the guy that thought he was a very good bison hunter could rent the horse from the owner. And so you have a very interestingly developed sort of an economy. Now, that doesn't give us a full picture of the situation with Native Americans. Here's another Charlie Russell painting called The Toll. And the toll, excuse me, oops, let's see, I missed one. Okay, figuring out what's going on here. The Indians were put on the reservations in 1887 out of the Dawes Act, and then there was the Indian Reorganization Act of 1934. And that really turned into a paternalistic sort of a world. The natives on the reservations actually did a pretty good job of adapting to the conditions that they had to live with until the Dawes Act and the Indian Reorganization Act. And those two acts really, rather than giving full property rights to the Indians, made the Bureau of Indian Affairs a partial owner. Much of the land on the reservation is held in trust, which means that the Native American has a right to it, but that decisions have to go through the Bureau of Indian Affairs. So if you want to lease the land to somebody else, if you want to consolidate it with somebody else's holding, if you want to change the crops, you need to get permission of people above you. So this is not a case of kind of recognizing the Native American culture and honoring it and then going ahead with the actions there that would cause there to be a relatively productive society. Trust land. There's also fees. There's tribal land, trust land owned by individuals, but with the BIA having the prior consent sort of a rule. And then there's fee simple land. Terry Anderson, the co-author of my book with me, he and another guy have done some extensive work looking at land on the reservations. Trust land is about 40 to 90% less productive than fee simple land. Why? Because the decisions are not controlled by the Native Americans on the ground in their particular position. The other interesting thing is, for a long period of time, the BIA did not regard Native Americans as competent to write wills. Can you believe that? You weren't allowed to write a will deciding how your property was going to be handed on. It had to be divided equally among all heirs. Now that really becomes important when you think about mineral rights, and then you think about the advent of oil and coal exploration on the reservations in the West. And you now have some places where mineral rights are owned between 1,000 and 2,000 people because of the heir situation, the way that the mineral rights were handed out. If you want to just look at that, look at the Fort Bethel Reservation in North Dakota and look at the oil development right up to the edge of the reservation. Lots of oil. Lots of oil wells till you get to the reservation. Once you get to the reservation, almost no oil wells. It's not because the Native Americans wouldn't like to have oil development, just because the transaction costs were so very high for the oil company to deal with the multiple number of owners. And you have to get them all signed off. And so that's just been a way of costs that were imposed upon them. There is a famous painting called The Toll by Charlie Russell. The Native Americans basically did have control, and they exercised their control in lots of situations. This is a case of a trail drive, and the Native Americans were charging a fee. You can see the chief there holding up a finger, maybe not the finger that you would hold up, but he's saying, cut out a beef. And you can see somebody in the background there cutting one out. And that's the toll. So for a period of time, there was a fairly reasonable recognition of Native American rights. However, something that changed that rather dramatically was the advent of the standing army. After the Mexican-American War, and then after the Civil War, we got a whole series of forts across the West. And so now we do have formal institutions. We have the military in place. And the military is an interesting situation. They're getting paid to be there. They wouldn't mind. There is kind of, from their perspective, there's an optimal amount of conflict because they need something to do, and your troops are pretty bored, and it would be nice to have at least some battles going on. There's a very interesting article called Raid or Trade. It's in the Journal of Law and Economics, again by Terry Anderson and another guy, Fred McChesney. And they look at the change in relationships with Native Americans. If you go east of the Mississippi, it wasn't all great, but by and large, there was a much more substantial recognition of the indigenous peoples. Claimed they had rights, that you had to deal with those sorts of rights. Now, the Trail of Tears for the Cherokee Indians is one of the exceptions, but once you got to the west, a couple of things. You were sometimes dealing more with the nomadic people, and it was a little harder to figure out what sorts of rights you traded. The other sort of a big change was the advent of the standing army. Prior to the advent of the standing army, you didn't have a lot of force on your side if you were a settler. You were much more likely to engage in treaties, to reasonable sorts of negotiations, and to honor those sorts of treaties. Think about where the horrendous battles have occurred, or there are lots of just injustices. Most of them are in the West. Most of them are in the West once you have the military that the settlers decide to co-opt for their particular advantage. Here's another interesting case, General George Armstrong Custer. Any of you that have been to the Battle of the Little Bighorn know that that's not a very accurate picture. It actually takes place for 2 or 3 miles up and down the Little Bighorn River, and you can look at the different graves, and there'll be a soldier die here and 2 or 3 over there. So that's not the way it was, but the whole Custer's regiment was all wiped out. The other interesting thing, General George Armstrong Custer was probably a glory hound and was probably trying to get some extra advantage for himself. The other interesting thing, do you know what General George Armstrong Custer's real rank was? He was a brevet general. What does brevet mean? Brevet means temporary because of conflict. Armstrong came out of the Civil War, both in the Mexican-American War and in the Civil War. They would run short on officers. So they would just take somebody out of the line and move them up. And they gave them rank. And the rank was called brevet. And brevet meant as long as there was conflict, you had that you could stay in that particular position. Now, it's a little hard to figure out exactly what was going on in Custer's mind, but the fact that he was a brevet general and the fact that most of his other officers were brevet officers had something to do with the degree of conflict. So, we're going to be talking mostly about localized institutions. Here's a big picture institution, and one of the lessons here is sometimes big picture institutions get it well, do it well. Sometimes they don't do it so well. And here's one where the interest captured that particular institution, namely the Army, for their advantage. Let's go to settlers. With settlers, it was somewhat different. Here's a picture of sluice mining. Sluice mining is where there's gold in the gravel deposits, and these guys are shoveling gravel into this sluice box. And of course, the early way was panning. This is just a little bit bigger form than panning for gold. And you run the water over the gold. You put some little blockages in there, and the gold catches, and that's how you get gold. Here's a statement by a historian about what they expected to go on with that sort of a situation. They predict that the gold regions of California will be a theater of tragic events, scene of bloodshed and strife. The sun never shone on a more motley crowd than will be assembled there. The law will be powerless, rights will be disregarded, reason dethroned, and brute force will reign triumphant. Let's go back to the sluice miners. Not the case. Fighting over the gold was pretty expensive. They figured out ways to solve that problem. An economic historian by the name of Umbeck has looked at all these, they were clubs or constitutions. Each gold strike had its own set of rules. They set out what you had to do to establish your claim. They said how big your claim can be. Interestingly enough, the claims differed in size depending on how rich the gold deposit was. If the deposit was quite rich, then you had very small claims. If it was gold was spread out over a longer area, then you had larger claims. There were rules about how did you determine if somebody had deserted their claim, because sometimes people moved on, so there were all those sorts of rules. Now again, you want to mine gold, so having a full-time peace officer is pretty expensive. The peace officer says, I don't want to be out here standing around with my 6th gun, I want to be mining gold. So they did not have full-time peace officers. Whenever there was a dispute, a cry would go through the camp saying, claim jumper, claim jumper. Every miner was obligated to show up. They impaneled a jury. They heard both sides of the case, and they made their decision. Now again, running a jail is pretty expensive. So you didn't jail them, you just put them out of if there's a miscreant, if there was somebody disobeying the rules, you kicked them out. You said, okay, you can't be here and mine gold with us. The gold camps, in the face of a very valuable commodity, lots of people from very different backgrounds, all of them armed, found a way to solve collective action sorts of problems. Let's go to wagon trains. This is a picture of a wagon train between 1840 and 1860. Over 300,000 immigrants crossed the Great Plains. Of course, some of them were coming for in the latter part of the period because of the gold strike at Sutter's Mill in 1848. They were also going to relatively rich agricultural places in Oregon. Again, you'd think, boy, this could be a real place of conflict. They're all trying to get together and get across the plains. It was a pretty arduous, sometimes 4-month, sometimes 5-month sort of a journey. So they're trying to get across the plains. They're armed. They want to get the valuable resources. So surely they shoot each other up all the time. Not the case. Before you took off from your jumping off place, which was usually St. Joseph, Missouri, or some other place along there, you wrote a constitution. You asked everybody that was going to be a part of that particular wagon train to sign on to the Constitution. It set out who was going to be the trail boss. It decided how you would resolve problems when you were on the wagon train. And one of the problems, of course, was breaking up, because sometimes the wagon trains decided they were too big. Sometimes some of them decided they wanted to go to one place, wanted someone to go to another one. Here's a quotation from John Philip Reed, probably the preeminent historian of that period of time. And he says, no. He says it was a time of sharing rather than of dividing. Far removed from lawyers and courts, it proved to be one of legal strength. The Overland Trail was not a place of conflict. More accurately, it was a place of settlement. Again, people trying to decide how they're going to solve problems of getting together, dealing with particular issues. Okay, let's go to another one that's a little more controversial, and you're going to hear from me a little differently than what you would hear even from a lot of economics textbooks. The bison or the buffalo are considered one of the great tragedies of the commons, because nobody owned them and therefore everybody shot them. And here's a picture of skinning the bison. This is how it happened on the Great Plains. Let's go on to the next one there. There would be a hunter and there would be skinners, and they'd skin them. Most of the time they would leave the meat to lay there. They would take the hide, they would take the tongue, they would put them onto a, in the right order here, onto a wagon and haul the hide away. Here's a picture. There were a lot of bison killed. We're not sure about the estimates, but we think in 1830 or so there were probably about 30 million. We're pretty confident that in 1870 there were 10 million. 10 million is still a lot of bison. And by 1883 there were 1,000. So they were killed off very rapidly. Let's go to the next one here. This is a picture of bison skulls. Can you imagine that at a railhead? They're being hauled off for fertilizer. So they were killed, and they were killed rapidly. So as we look at these bison, isn't the question that this was a tragedy of the commons? I would argue, no. It was an efficient economic process. Why? Because cattle did a much better job of converting grass to meat and then going to production than did the bison. Between 1866 and 1884, 5 million cattle came to the Great Plains. Why? Now the bison were actually very good converters of grass to meat. But during this period of time, the railroads were coming to the west. You get the Transcontinental Railroad, 1869. You get the rail coming to Miles City, Montana, in 1882. So the rails are opening up. And what you really want is now you've got a marketable commodity, namely grass, that needs to be then converted. So it gets converted to meat. And then it has to get back to the eastern market. The difficulty was not in the conversion process. The difficulty was in the transportation process. 10 cowboys could trail 3,000 head of cattle to the railhead. Cattle were a domesticated animal. The bison were never domesticated. It took 10 cowboys, couldn't get 10 bison to the railhead. So it turned out to be immensely expensive. Here's a picture of actually hauling bison. This is the bison of Michael Pablo on the Flathead Reservation. He had established a herd in the 1890s, and by 1900 he decided that there were going to be enough settlers around. It was going to be expensive to keep them. He wanted to sell them to the US federal government. They didn't want to buy them. He sold them to the Canadian government. So he wanted to transport these bison live to Canada. Well, it's quite a job to transport a live bison. Each one of those wagons has a cart in it with one live bison in it. They got the bison in corrals. They finally got them in. They specially built these particular carts. They hauled them to the railhead, and they tried to load them on the rail. Pretty hard to do. Again, the cattle could be taken to market much easier. And so, let's go to the actual data here. It cost about 21 cents a ton mile to get a bison to the railhead. It cost about 1 cent per ton mile to get cattle to the railhead. So, what did they do? So the hunters were not necessarily in the service of the cattlemen, but there was kind of this historical accident that allowed the bison to be killed off and to be replaced by cattle. However, there may be another issue here. Oh yeah, we got bison up there. Isn't there some other value to bison other than producing grass? What about what we would call the amenity value? What about the fact that, I like the fact that all the bison weren't killed off. I appreciate the fact that I can go to Custer State Park and look at bison. I can go to Yellowstone Park and look at bison. Actually, I can go about 40 miles south of where I live in Montana, and there's a large ranch there, 130,000 acres, that has about 3,500 head of bison on it. There's actually a Forest Service road through that that you can take to look at the bison there. It turns out that private entrepreneurs actually saw what we would call the non-consumptive value of bison. Michael Pablo, Charles Goodnight, several other people did, and today there are about 400,000 bison in the northern Great Plains. Now, is that enough in order to solve all of those sorts of problems? I don't know. If we wanted more, there probably would be more. So the bison problem in terms of a productive resource, they're still used sometimes to produce, but it's mostly people that want to do something about the niche market. And there is Ted Turner's Ted Montana Grill. I don't know if any of them are out here or not, and he will serve bison there, and there was actually a market for them. But this is not a great tragedy. It was like cutting down trees someplace in the Midwest to plant corn. And we did. Now, would we still like to have some trees? Yeah. Are there trees? A lot of places in the Midwest there are. What about bison? Well, the bison for amenity value are still there. Another sort of a case. What about the trail herds? Trailing cattle north from Texas to Montana, to Wyoming. Let's go to the Charles Russell painting again. Relatively peaceful actions between the Native Americans, the toll over this period of time. Cattle trails that came from Texas to Montana, Wyoming, some to Nebraska, North and South Dakota. And as I mentioned, it's the greatest overland movement of domestic animals we've ever seen. 5 million cattle over a period of about 20 years. How did they organize that? Well, it was an interesting industrial organization sort of a question. What kind of a firm do you put together? They were not trailed by the people who owned them. There would be a trail boss that would put together a group of cattle from other people that owned them. Sometimes he trailed them for a share of the purchase price of the people at the end of the trail. Sometimes he trailed them at a per head sort of a price. Very interesting labor contract, because if you're taking off from Texas with 10 cowboys, you don't want 4 of them when you're about halfway there to decide they're going home. So your contract usually involved payment at the end. Here's a picture of, these are the picture of the trails. Here's a picture of Charles Goodnight, one of the famous trail sort of a people. Again, relatively peaceful. Interesting organizations. People from the bottom up decided how to organize the firms, how to bring about productive sort of an action in that sort of a case. There was the case in the Great Plains about the ownership of animals. And since many of the ranches did not have exterior fences, boundary fences, they went with branding. So let's go to, here's a picture of some of the famous brands. And brands were simply a way of establishing ownership. Interestingly enough, we now see some involvement of government. The first legislatures, even when they were territorial, would establish a legal brand registration system in the territory or the state. So government was involved. In this case, government was involved in reducing transaction costs. And government can be an effective transaction cost reducer. So the brand registrations came. Here I have in Montana, there is a statewide registration system, and I have the PJ brand, came from my grandfather, Pete Jensen, who registered that brand in the 1890s. There are almost no what we call simple 2-letter brands now. I've probably been to 50 or 100 brandings in my career, and I've never been to one that's just had 2 letters, because most of those were gone by 1895 or 1900. They're, you know, P/hanging J quarter circle or something like that. But in Montana, if you've got a cow and she's got a P on the left rib and a J on the left hip, you either don't own it or you better have a bill of sale, because it belongs to me. Or if you have a horse that has a PJ on the left shoulder, it belongs to me. Here we are doing a little local roundup, and I even put a PJ on the barn so people would know whose place it was. Another branding a little bit earlier. So the brand was a fairly effective way of establishing ownership. There was a problem, though, that on the open range, there might be, again, the tragedy of the commons. Because you could establish property rights to local pieces of range, but much of the range it was not possible to establish property rights to. The federal government owned it. We'll talk a little bit about homesteading in a bit, but it was difficult to have outside boundaries closed. And so you could say, well, maybe the cattle producers would put far too many cattle on, because it is an open access resource, which can lead to the tragedy of the commons. This problem was actually solved by community roundups. You had to join a roundup with about 6 to 10 other ranchers. The cattle would run on the open range through the summer. They would have to be rounded up in the springtime to be branded, the calves to be branded, and then in the fall they would have to be, you'd have to cut out the fat beeves in order to ship them to market. Trail them to the trailhead, again the example of trailing cattle to the railhead and then going to the eastern markets. If you didn't obey the rules about the range rights that established how many cattle you could have, if you didn't obey the rules about the range rights, you weren't allowed to be a part of the roundup. And you were not allowed to be really an effective rancher. Teddy Roosevelt in 1884 bought a ranch in North Dakota. He announced he was going to increase its number of cattle from 800 head to about 1,200 head. The next day, 4 ranchers showed up on his doorstep and said, Mr. Roosevelt, you bought a ranch and it had range rights, but it didn't have range rights to 1,200 head. And if you know what's good for you, you will not run that many cattle. And Teddy Roosevelt said, okay, I agree. That is a reasonable sort of a rule. I think this picture is an interesting one because here you can see an animal that's just cut out of the herd and the horsebacker's right behind it there. And evidently the animal was maybe going straight ahead and now he's making a quick cut to the right. And you can tell the person's riding a pretty good horse. Look at him set his front feet to make that turn behind the animal. My guess is that that's happening even before the guy can touch his reins and make him turn. A good horse will make that turn immediately when the animal does. So the roundups were a way of doing it. Line camps were another way of doing it. You put a camp up on a ridge between 2 ranchers, and the cowboys were obligated to try to throw cattle on both sides back to their home ranges in a way of trying to do that. We did get barbed wire. It was clearly going to be a productive sort of a resource, and there were lots of attempts to try to come up with barbed wire. In 1873, Joseph Glidden in DeKalb, Illinois, was the first person to patent a successful barbed wire, and that was very useful on the range to try to establish rights. By 1880, they had sold enough wire to fence 500,000 miles of fence, 4 strands. So the barbed wire was it was a response to a property rights problem. However, there came along the Homestead Act. 1862. Here's a typical description of the Homestead Act. It was established at no cost. In all, more than 270 million acres of public land was given away free to 1.6 million homesteaders. True? No. You didn't bid for it with money. You bid for it with your life. You bid for it. The land was valuable. Maybe in 1880 it was going to be a productive piece of land. When do you go there? Well, you don't wait till 1880, somebody else is going to be there. You go in 1879, but some other people are going to be there in 1879. Suppose what economists call the present discounted value of a piece of land is $1,000. How much will you bid in your time and your effort to try to get there? You'll bid up to $1,000. It's as if President Arnn announces that, hey, you know, we got some extra money here, and we think that Charles Steele is the guy to hand it out, and next week at 8 a.m., the first 100 students that come can get $500. 8 a.m. at Charles's office. Well, somebody says, you know, I think I'll be there at 7:30. Somebody else says, I think I'll be there at 6:30. They say, well, do you allow sleeping overnight? Well, yeah, we do. How much will you bid to get $500? You bid $500 of your time. Now, there was bad information, all sorts of interesting issues with regard to what was productive there, but the average claim, or what they allowed, was 160 acres. That was all that you could get in a claim. Now, they modified that a couple of times. There was the Irrigation Act and the Timber Act, and then in 1909 and 1914 they expanded it somewhat. But it was really a race for property rights. And they caused people to race by being there before it was productive. You had to live there for 5 years. You had to plow a certain portion of the land. And it was holding up a goodie in front of people and saying, What will you bid for it? So the Homestead Act is actually one of the great tragedies of the American West, along with the problem that agriculturally it didn't make sense. It was 160 acres, then it went to finally in 1909 to 320, and then finally in 1916 it went to 640 acres. The most you could get was 640 acres. It takes between 20 and 30 acres to run a cow on the shortgrass prairies of the Great Plains, and the most you can get is 640 acres. Think how many cows you can run. Our family ranch is very much just a family-sized operation. My dad and I ran it. Once in a while we'd have a hired man for a period of time until he went to town and got drunk enough and we had to fire him, but we had some pretty good hired men too. Our ranch was 25,000 acres. That was a normal operating size. So you can see how ill-fitted the Homestead Acts were. Let's turn to an actual case of racing. Let me see. Oh yeah, here's a picture I forgot about this one. Picture of the homesteaders. That's what you call a sod shanty. Those are piles of grass that are up there. I think it's kind of interesting. The cow up on the roof. It looks like this is probably a pretty wealthy one. They've got a team and they've got a cow and they've got some of their possessions out there. But in the 1890s, the settlement had passed by Oklahoma. Oklahoma had been all settled, except for the Cherokee Strip. It was a strip of 8.4 million acres along the northern part of Oklahoma. It was actually given to the Cherokee Indians because when they were moved from the southeast, and at least some attempt to try to give them something, they decided to lease it to ranchers in the area. They did that. The government decided, well, it's really pretty valuable land. Maybe we should make it available to settlers. The Cherokees, under duress, actually signed to sell their land. They sold it for less than what they were getting out of the ranchers, which might tell you that it wasn't particularly a voluntary transfer. But there were these 8.4 million acres, and they announced that on September 16th, 1893, you could rush onto that land and get a claim. Now, you had to have a permit. So here's a picture of people standing to get the permit to run. Actually, about 10,000 people stood in line to get, at one time, 9 people died standing in line. The race was over in less than 12 hours, and they had horses. They were all set to go. One person counted, in the first 2 miles, there were 40 dead horses that people had run to death trying to get there. So this was racing for property rights. Now this just happened in a very short period of time, but it's still the same racing that would occur as people would come to the frontier. Now if you make it very, very hard to get property rights, sometimes you get fraud. And here's one of the cases of fraud. The original legislation said that you had to have 12 by 14 dwelling place. So this guy actually has a 12 by 14 dwelling place. But so there was fraud. Some people would try to get by the system. Eventually, the homesteading produced some property rights, and then the homesteads were consolidated and they were put into the appropriate sort of form. And there was a way of establishing property rights, but it was a very, very expensive way. And people still claim it was an era of free land because you didn't pay cash. You paid with your time. You paid with your suffering. Okay, I thought I'd end with a family picture here. Here's my wife and kids and our. Let me see here. Oh no, that's not it. That's not it. My wife's with me, and she actually doesn't think it's that funny. When I finished my PhD and moved back to the ranch with my wife, we did have a house that was slightly better than this, but it wasn't a lot different than that. For our wedding present, we put in indoor plumbing, so that was a big thing in that place. Okay, what do we learn from this? What are some of the lessons that we have from this? First one is conflict is negative sum. Doesn't mean we don't have conflict, but it means there are incentives to try to figure out ways to get along. And it means that cooperation is positive sum. What's essential to cooperation? well-defined and enforced property rights, knowing what you have, knowing what you can use. And that's one of the main sorts of things they did on the frontier, was to define and enforce property rights and to make them transferable. And the other lesson that I would draw from this is that bottom-up institutional change can produce order and gains from trade, and that's really what the West is about. Now, there were cases of injustice, particularly with regard to the indigenous peoples. They were not treated fairly, particularly as time went on with the reservation system and not granting them full rights. You could get into a fight on the frontier. Most of the time it was a couple of liquored up cowboys in a bar with fisticuffs. There were some shootings. There were, I've looked at murder rates, but big controversy about how, that I was involved with it for a while. How big were the conflict sorts of times. There was the Johnson County War in Wyoming. Now that was interesting because they actually got the Army on their side in that one. Another case study in which sometimes large-scale coercive agencies don't get involved on the side of justice. I would point out, interestingly, from my perspective, interestingly enough, that most of the rights that were created on the frontier were what I would call negative rights, which means the right to be left alone, the right to have your property defended, and the right to engage in transfers with other people. Philosophers talk about negative rights and they talk about positive rights. Positive rights are not just a right to be left alone, it's a right to a certain capacity. And if you have a right to a certain capacity, then other people are obligated to enhance your capacity. Now, you can argue about that one, if that's good or bad, but on the frontier, they were not into enhancing other people's capacities. Whatever you brought to the game, whatever you were equipped to do. And so it was a world in which rights were defined, they were enforced, and they became the basis of all sorts of productive activity. I would argue it was not a place of anarchy, it was not a place of chaos, it was really a place of reasonable amount of getting along. Okay, all done. Questions? Yes?
When you were talking about the ranchers and their coming together in roundups,
Mm-hmm.
you mentioned range rights.
Mm-hmm.
Who would enforce them?
Good question. Yeah. Mutual agreement among the ranchers. There was no government enforcement of them, but it was ranchers who were there first, and they actually allowed more people to come in, and so those were mutually agreed upon rights. I don't have any evidence of conflict over them. You'd expect at least some, and you'd expect that maybe the people that were there first would try to exercise some extra power. The range was populated so rapidly in the 1880s, there was hard to be the first person and then to get control over thousands and thousands of acres. You pretty much had to agree to get along with the other people that arrived almost simultaneously. And so they made decisions about what they thought the carrying capacity of a particular range would be. They assigned the rights to those, and then those became fairly effective. And we have evidence of quite a few contracts where the range rights were valuable enough they were included in a ranch sale contract. And that was the problem with Teddy Roosevelt. He bought a ranch, he had legal rights, he just didn't think the range rights meant much, and they actually did. So it's not clear over the long term, would that have worked? I don't know. Yes?
Did that grow out of something else? Was there some other form of association?
Well, the homesteading broke it up because the homesteading, started in 1862, but it really didn't hit much of the plains till after the turn of the century. And the cattlemen had several meetings in which they argued with the federal government, can we get some lease rights? Can we get some legal sorts of rights? There was a National Cattlemen's Convention in the 1890s in Texas, and they were saying, is there a way we can actually, we know you're not going to sell it to us, but can we lease it? And no. The Homestead Act had the cachet of appearing to be good for the politicians because they were giving something away free. And so they continued. So despite the fact it was so clear that 160 acres was not a productive unit, that politicians from the West were in favor of doing something about it, politicians from the East. Legislation came up several times in Congress. So the homesteading broke that up in a sense, because then you got a lot of homesteaders. There's probably 10 to 15 homesteads on what was my family ranch. We've now sold it. My grandfather bought them out. My grandmother fed them. They would be there and they'd come and say, hey, look, Mrs. Jensen, we don't have food for the next month. And she would provide them with milk and eggs so that they could get by. So some of them didn't make it. Some of them I'd be riding with my dad and he'd say, over there's the Miller homestead. It was pretty hard to tell because most of the logs were dragged off. There weren't very many trees, so when a homesteader left, you dragged the logs in for one of your outbuildings at your ranch. But sometimes you'd see a burned out stove or you see some rocks left. But that, once you put that in the middle of the range, then that just changed the whole system. And the other thing that happened was the advent of sheep, and sheep didn't need to be rounded up, and so that was outside of the roundup thing, and so there was some conflict between sheep and cattle. Yes?
Thank you very much for your lecture. If I could just play devil's advocate for a minute.
Sure.
In our American history class at Hillsdale, we read FDR's Commonwealth Club address, which is sort of an anecdote to the American West, where he says, well, 80 years ago, 60 years ago, there was this safety valve that was the American West, all this property available, but now there's not. Mm-hmm. And so you've proven that laissez-faire capitalism worked extraordinarily well at the onset of the American West, but do you think that policies should be amended and changed and to be less anarcho-capitalistic when the West, if that's true, the safety valve dried up, or otherwise we get, like a grapes of wrath scenario?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, is the safety valve hypothesis is a big one in history, that the West always provided a place where people, the discontented, could go and they could establish a place to be and to live. The safety valve hypothesis doesn't seem to hold up to me because it required such an investment to get going. It was not a place that an indigent person could go and just establish freely. It took capital, it just took physical capital, it took horses, it took a plow, and so the safety valve thesis there doesn't seem to me to make sense. In terms of safety valves generally, I think you want a way for people in a modern society to have safety valves. I actually think, reasonably free public education is a way to go about doing it. We invest about every American gets about $160,000 of free education. Now this is just through high school. That's an investment. Do we do a good job of it? We do a crummy job of it in some places, particularly inner city schools. I mean, it's not working, and there's a lot of reasons I could give you for why it's not working. But I see that in a sense as a safety valve. Human capital is so much more important than physical capital today. That giving people access to physical capital, to human capital, you could say is a safety valve for people that would like a way to invest in productive activity. And so I'm a big school choice person, I would go with freedom of choice in so doing. You can have school choice, you can have an education system that's completely private, just let people pay for it themselves. I don't have a big issue about running that as a safety valve or an income equalization measure for those people that want to take advantage of it and get educated. Yes?
Sure. How much influence did the Native American ideas of property and property rights have on the settlers coming into the West?
Okay, you probably couldn't hear that in the back, and I'm sorry I didn't repeat your question either. How much influence did the idea of property have on people coming in?
The Native American idea.
Oh, the Native American idea. Well, they were using different property in different ways, and so it's a little hard to say. They were just different cultures, and so it was hard for those two cultures to try to rely upon each other. That's an interesting question, though. I've not really gone back and thought about the property rights in that sort of a setting. See, part of the interesting thing is until the advent of the horse, there was no question but what there were bison, plenty of bison. Once you get the horse and you get the gun, it's not clear if the bison would have lasted in the face of Native American depredation either. So it's a world of such change. The horse changes things a lot. The gun changes things a lot. You certainly could have tried to rely upon those. Most of the settlers had some idea of property rights. They might have come out of a society where they didn't have as many property rights as they wanted. Many immigrants came from a society, say, Eastern Europe, where they didn't think they had full property rights. And so they seemed to understand it, and they seemed to be pretty anxious to put it in place. The actual interchange between Native American ideas and property rights and I'm just not sure about that one. I'll think about that one and send you an email at some point. Yes?
You were talking about how in the West, the idea of property rights and property right frameworks was pretty informal and flexible.
Mm-hmm.
I'm wondering whether there's an argument to be made that one of the reasons why there were less major crimes is because people like bank robbers had a harder time, predicting and gaming the system of laws and norms because it was constantly kind of shifting. It wasn't exactly pinned down, and there was a kind of a decentralization of enforcement. Whereas maybe in some of the more developed Eastern states, it was easier to do big crimes like that because since there was a centralized arm of enforcement, they were able to effectively, game persist and game out their.
That certainly played a role. Umbeck, the guy that has done the work on mining camps, has argued the fact that everybody was armed and was pretty equally armed made a difference. So, nobody had large amounts of armaments that were, you got into an argument, you were about as equally powerful as the other people. And he says it was just the existence of the six-gun that created rules that kind of recognized everybody's sorts of rights. That could well be. Without the stability, you don't really know who you want to rob. Interesting hypothesis, one I haven't thought about.
All right, that's all we have for questions right now. Thank you, Dr. Hill.
Okay. Where's my 10 guy?